A respected woman was publicly humiliated by a police officer who mistook authority for power. Derek Milton, hardened by years on the force, acted without restraint, never imagining that fate would soon turn his arrogance against him. When he walked into court and saw Camilla Johnson sitting on the judge's bench, his world collapsed in one silent instant. But only wait until you see how this gripping twist of justice unfolds, and why, in the end, truth spoke louder than power itself. Rain streamed down the windshield in endless sheets, turning the city into a blur of color and sodium light. The hum of patrol car tires against wet pavement was the only sound filling the empty space inside Officer Derek Milton's vehicle. He watched the streetlights pass in rhythm, his jaw clenched, his mind fogged by fatigue and years of grinding duty that had long eroded his patience. Atlanta felt heavier these days, louder, angrier, less forgiving. Derek was not a bad man by design. He had once believed in honor, in serving the people, in being part of something that kept chaos from swallowing the city whole. But repetition had soured those ideals. He had seen too much lies, noise, betrayal, until compassion turned into armor and empathy was replaced by procedure. Somewhere along the years, his badge began to feel more like a shield than a symbol. The radio crackled. Unit 12. Disturbance at Java Point Cafe, Auburn Avenue. Female subject refusing to leave. Possible confrontation. He exhaled a slow, weary breath. Rain hammered harder against the roof. Auburn Avenue. Again. The calls from there were routine. Disputes over bills, loud arguments, drunken ramblings. He switched on the siren, its wail slicing through the downpour, and steered the cruiser toward the glowing grid of narrow downtown streets. The cafe came into view, a small corner place with fogged-up windows and dim amber lights. Through the glass, silhouettes moved restlessly. Derek parked, stepped out, and pulled his jacket tight as the rain hit him in cold, persistent drops. The sound of chatter and tension seeped through the door before he even opened it. Inside, the atmosphere was taut. The barista looked pale and nervous. Customers whispered. Phones were raised discreetly, recording. At the center stood a woman, composed, poised, her dark hair pulled neatly back, a file bag over her shoulder. She wasn't shouting, merely demanding to be heard. Her name, though Derek didn't yet know it, was Camilla Johnson, 40 years old, professor of constitutional law at Emory University. She had stopped by the cafe after an evening lecture, planning to review a case note before heading home. But when the cashier dismissed her request without reason and told her to just leave, something inside her refused to let it slide. She had seen too many quiet injustices slip by under the label of politeness. Today, she decided, silence would not do. Derek approached, eyes already hardened from countless similar situations. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," he said, his tone flat and official, a rehearsed command that carried more authority than empathy. Calm down. It was a phrase she had heard before, in classrooms, in meetings, in moments when her calmness was mistaken for defiance. She turned slowly, meeting his stare with measured composure. "I am calm, officer," she replied, "but I won't leave until I'm treated fairly." The exchange was sharp, quiet, electric, the kind that pulls a crowd into stillness, where every move feels one breath away from escalation. Something in Derek's mind flickered, a mixture of reflex and defensiveness. He wasn't hearing her words anymore, only tone, posture, challenge. To him it was another person questioning his control, another test of the authority he clung to. The seconds that followed blurred into confusion. There were startled voices, the scrape of chairs, the instinctive move forward, the order that came out louder than intended. A misstep, a reaction, the familiar tightening of adrenaline in his veins. And then, silence. Rain drummed against the windows. The crowd stood frozen. Derek's chest rose and fell too fast. His radio buzzed faintly somewhere behind him. On the floor, paramedics now knelt beside Camilla, checking her pulse, their voices calm but urgent. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Her gaze, steady and clear, found his face. There was no hatred in it, only disappointment. the quiet kind that pierces more deeply than rage. People outside had gathered with phones pointed at the windows. The glow of their screens painted the damp sidewalk with pale, ghostly light. Derek felt the weight of their eyes, the murmurs of disapproval, the invisible cloud of public judgment forming around him even before he understood what he'd done. Back at the station, hours later, he sat at the metal desk, pen scratching against paper as he filled out his report. The fluorescent light above flickered weakly. His partner had already gone home. Derek stared at the half-finished paragraph. Subject became uncooperative and resisted. He stopped, raised his head, and caught his reflection in the darkened window. The face looking back seemed older than he remembered. Eyes heavy, shoulders stiff, guilt forming where denial tried to stand. He set the pen down. The rain outside had stopped, but the sound of the storm still echoed in his ears. Across town, in a quiet hospital room, Camilla lay awake under the hum of medical monitors. Her hands rested neatly on her lap, a soft glow of lamplight reflecting in her thoughtful eyes. She replayed every second in her memory. The frustration, the disbelief, the calm voice she refused to lose. Not once did she wish for revenge. What she wanted was balance, the kind of justice that didn't come from anger, but from truth. She opened her notebook and began to write, not a complaint, not a report, just a few words that came to her without force. Every action taken in arrogance will meet its equal in consequence. Outside, dawn stretched pale light across the city, washing the streets clean again. Neither she nor Derek yet knew they would meet again, not on the street but in a courtroom, where their roles would trade places, and justice would finally stare back at its own reflection. In the days that followed, the city's rhythm pulsed on, unaware of the private consequences unfolding behind closed doors. Camilla Johnson returned home from the hospital to an apartment filled with flowers and messages of support, from neighbors, students, and colleagues who had seen the videos circulating on social media and local news. A chorus of solidarity rose around her, yet inside she felt isolated, carrying the weight of a bruised body and a shaken faith in the law she'd devoted her life to teaching. Sleep escaped her. Night after night the encounter replayed, the sound of the rain, the crackle of commands, the cold grip on her shoulder. She awoke in the early hours with a tightness in her chest, unsure whether she wished for anger or simply for the whole episode to fade. When she spoke to her closest friends, her tone was measured but honest. "I thought I knew what it was like to feel invisible, but this is different. It's like knowing everyone sees you, but nobody can really understand." Meanwhile, in another part of Atlanta, Officer Derek Milton faced his own reckoning. He arrived at the station the morning after the incident, to an unusual chill in the air. The chief's office called him in for a meeting that lasted only minutes. Derek listened as his superiors outlined the next steps: an internal investigation, suspension with pay, and instructions not to speak about the ongoing case. In the locker room, the other officers watched in silence, some offering stiff nods, others looking away, uncertain where the boundaries of loyalty fell. Derek's pride had never wavered before, but now every glance from a colleague felt like judgment, and every silence like blame. At home, his family tried to comfort him with quiet dinners and brief words of encouragement. He tried to convince himself he was simply unlucky, the victim of circumstances. Yet as headlines multiplied and the city debated, a sense of unease settled inside him. He wondered if, in the flash of that moment at the cafe, he had lost more than just composure. For both Camilla and Derek, the days extended into a liminal stretch. Neither justice nor forgiveness seemed close. Camilla spent hours recording her thoughts in a journal, channeling pain into ideas for future lectures. She researched emotional trauma, its legal standing, and how victims could pursue recourse for psychological harm. The experience exposed fault lines in the system she once trusted. Stories of past misconduct, survivors who never saw restitution, officers rarely dismissed except in the gravest of cases. When news crews knocked on Camilla's door, she stayed polite but firm. She didn't want to be a symbol, nor did she want pity. Her only demand was transparency. If the law cannot protect the citizen, then it should be humbled enough to answer for itself. In city offices and legal corridors, calls for accountability echoed. Advocacy groups organized candlelight vigils, students debated institutional reform, and public officials promised action. A formal inquiry was begun. Interviews conducted. Statements recorded. Derek was summoned to provide his version. Camilla appeared before investigators, both following the intricate protocols of complaint, evidence, and due process. Yet beneath every official conversation, both lived with a different reality. Camilla's trust, in the system and in her own ability to find peace, was tested every time she entered a public building or answered a call from a journalist. Derek's resolve faltered as he waited, alone, for a verdict that would decide not only his career, but the meaning of the uniform he had worn for a decade. In those weeks, the city kept pulling towards a resolution it could believe in, but for Camilla and Derek, no easy answers presented themselves. The future waited beyond the horizon, both dreaded and needed. What had occurred between them had become part of Atlanta's history, a story that would not be forgotten no matter what the inquiry decided. And as the first notifications for the trial arrived in their mailboxes, each understood. Their confrontation would soon move from private memory to public record. Neither knew how the process would change them, but both carried its weight as they prepared for the next chapter. The city courthouse was a monument of stone, glass, and quiet anticipation that morning, its grand steps crawling with reporters, lawyers, and citizens huddled beneath umbrellas, their voices muffled by drizzle and tense expectation. For those arriving, this was just another case, one more headline in a season of controversy and debate. For Camilla, it was the crossing of a threshold she hadn't imagined when she stood in that cafe just months earlier. Camilla entered through a back entrance, surrounded by her legal team and soft-walled by courteous security, her expression calm, but fiercely attentive. Every detail seemed brighter. The scrape of shoes echoing in high-ceilinged halls, the clatter of keys at checkpoints, the nervous rustle of files. In her mind, she recited the timeline over and over, grounding herself in fact and memory. This was no longer a personal ordeal. It had become a test of the legal system itself, one she intended to face with integrity and resolve. In preparation for trial, her attorneys had built their case meticulously. Hours were spent poring over medical records, reviewing witness statements, and compiling expert testimony about both her physical injuries and the less visible impact, the recurring anxiety, sleeplessness, and bruised sense of security. Every meeting with her lawyers reminded Camilla of the stakes, not just for herself, but for every person who might one day confront the same crossroads. For Derek, the courthouse signaled a different confrontation. He arrived in uniform, only to change into a suit in the basement room allotted for defendants, his badge locked away in a desk drawer by order of the department. Under harsh fluorescent light, he went over his own testimony with legal counsel hired by the police union. His instructions were simple: stick to what could be proven, maintain that his actions were in line with training, avoid speculation. Privately, however, Derek felt the pressure of public scrutiny. His friends and colleagues were divided. Some sent quiet texts of solidarity, others kept their distance. His family grew increasingly anxious, eyes flicking to the news whenever his case appeared on screen. Court proceedings unfolded in a sequence at once familiar and strange. There were motions and counter-motions, legal arguments swapping places before the sun fully crested over the downtown skyline each morning. In the courtroom, the air was charged with expectation, the gallery brimming with activists, law students, and ordinary citizens carrying stories and hopes of their own. Some days the room was still, heavy with the gravity of testimony. Other days murmurs spread as new evidence came to light. Camilla testified with clear diction and unflinching recall, allowing the facts to build a portrait more convincing than outrage alone could offer. She spoke softly about the incident, framing it within a wider history of community trust and accountability. Her legal team called medical experts and mental health professionals to describe the toll on her body and mind, while witnesses from the cafe recounted the bewildering speed with which a civil dispute transformed into a public emergency. Derek's defense rested on policy and precedent. He explained his understanding of agency protocol, described the stress and uncertainty he felt when entering volatile situations, and again insisted he had not intended harm. There were moments when his composure faltered. Cross-examination probed his memories and motives, pushing him to confront the possibility that his judgment might have been clouded. He steered away from outright apology, but could not escape the sense that events had slipped beyond his control. Every day, outside the courthouse, Atlanta's pulse could be felt in the arguments over justice and reform. Television crews caught fragments of comment from lawyers, advocates, and ordinary passers-by. Some days protesters gathered peacefully, holding signs and candles. Other days an uneasy hush prevailed. The city seemed suspended, waiting for its institutions to choose a direction. Inside, the legal process became both shield and microscope. Attorneys exchanged evidence and countered each other's claims. Camilla's side worked to demonstrate a clear violation of civil rights, that the officer had acted with unnecessary force, disregarding protocols meant to protect all citizens equally. Derek's lawyers focused on challenging intent and emphasizing the chaotic, split-second nature of police work. Early hearings included motions to dismiss, requests for additional discovery, and heated arguments over the admissibility of footage captured by bystanders' phones, each side sparring for leverage. Witnesses took the stand. A barista's voice trembled as she described the chaos. Another customer recounted the sharp, wordless tension. Medical records and psychological evaluations were entered into evidence, illustrating the lasting aftermath. A case study, the court was reminded, not only in physical pain but in institutional responsibility. Yet for all the procedural steps, what happened between Camilla and Derek remained at the story's center. In pretrial conferences, the possibility of a settlement was raised and quietly rejected. Neither party wanted to compromise on principle. As opening arguments gave way to cross-examinations and summations, it became impossible to ignore the personal cliff's edge they both navigated. For Camilla, each appearance before the judge served as both trial and testament, proof that the system, however imperfect, could be forced to reckon with itself. For Derek it was an ordeal painted with shame and uncertainty, a test not only of his actions but of his future. The closing days of the trial, the courtroom felt transformed. Tension wound tighter, the press of public attention more acute. The judge's instructions to the jury rang out in careful, measured tones. Justice must weigh facts, not passions or headlines. The jury retired after days of debate, leaving both parties in a state of suspended animation. Camilla sat with her attorney in a private room, quietly reviewing a page of handwritten notes, reminders of her own worth, of the voices that had supported her since the night at the cafe. Derek, waiting with his counsel, tapped his knee in silent nerves, scanning memories for details that might have made a difference, wishing for a version of the past he could not recover. Outside, the city waited, its breath held for the decision that would ripple far beyond two individuals, reaching courtrooms, classrooms, and family tables across Atlanta. The verdict, when it came, would not restore all that had been lost. But as court officers moved down the hallway, carrying envelopes and verdict forms, every person in the building felt, for a rare, hard-won moment, the nearness of justice and the meaning of personal accountability. The courthouse filled slowly that morning, the air heavy with anticipation and faint echoes of rain tapping against high windows. Reporters whispered near the back rows, their equipment silent but prepared. At the front, Judge Everett reviewed the final notes before the jury returned. Every motion in the room held quiet weight. For weeks, both sides had wrestled with truth and reason. Now, everything narrowed to one moment. Camilla sat poised, her eyes steady on the judge's bench. There was stillness in her, a calm that came not from confidence but endurance. She had lived through the long months of hearings, testimonies, and cross-examinations. Every hour spent in that courtroom had been a reminder of the distance between principle and practice. Today felt like the closing of a long circle. Across from her, Derek shifted in his seat. The uniform he had once worn seemed like another lifetime. He had entered the service to protect, to build order, but his understanding of what that meant had changed. Now he sat stripped of certainty, realizing that the lines between duty and pride had blurred long ago. His attorney spoke quietly beside him, but his attention drifted elsewhere, to the voices he remembered, the faces of strangers in that cafe, the echo of a woman's composed defiance. The jury filed in. The courtroom turned motionless. The foreperson held a single page, its folds creased from hands that had argued and reasoned late into the night. "We the jury find the defendant." The words unfolded in clean, deliberate rhythm. Guilty. No one gasped. The silence that followed felt deeper than noise could reach. Derek lowered his gaze, a slow exhale breaking the still air. Camilla closed her eyes briefly, then lifted her chin. It wasn't triumph she felt, nor joy, only relief, mixed with something quieter, the sense that a balance had been restored. The judge thanked the jury and declared the session adjourned. Outside, daylight spilled over the courthouse steps. Reporters called questions into the air, voices overlapping in a blur of urgency. Camilla moved past them calmly, her attorney close behind. She gave no statements. The city could make its own interpretations. Her work, she felt, was already done. That evening she sat at her desk, a single lamp casting soft light over open pages. The same notebook lay before her, its last entry months old. She turned to a fresh sheet and wrote, "Justice isn't about punishment. It's the courage to face the truth, even when it costs you peace." Her hand trembled slightly, then stilled. In another part of the city, Derek stood by his car outside the precinct, the sound of engines and passing sirens washing through the gray morning. He handed over his identification card and badge, the metal cool against his palm. He murmured something inaudible, a fragment of regret or resolve, then walked toward the parking lot without looking back. The verdict spread through the city faster than the rain clouds cleared. Some saw closure, others saw an opening for reflection. Streets filled not with outrage but with thought, quiet conversations about restraint, reform, and responsibility. And somewhere between the courthouse and the city beyond it, both Camilla and Derek found something painfully human. Not victory or defeat, but understanding. The storm had passed. All that remained was light on wet pavement, and the fragile awareness that sometimes justice comes not with applause, but with silence that finally feels honest.